Okay, it's recording. I am going to be doing a presentation for you about incorporating sources for your final paper in English 1101. In this slideshow, I'll be talking about how to use paraphrase, summary, quote, citation, and quote sandwiches to incorporate sources into your papers. So there are three ways of using content from another source: quote, paraphrase, and summary. So when we talk about quoting, this should be pretty um, something that you've already know about. When we're talking about quoting, it's a word for word, copied and pasted straight from the original version of the original source. You use quotation marks to indicate where the quote begins and ends. So if you do use Control C and Control V or copy and paste from one document to your own, please be sure you get those quotation marks around it because you've just made a quote. Um, to When we're talking about paraphrase, that's when you take the original source and then you simplify it and put it into your own words. So, paraphrase takes a small section of the original text. It could be a paragraph, sentence, it could be a page, depending on how lengthy or some the sources that we're talking about. So, um, it's a condensed version of an original small section. So that differs from summary in that we take with the summary, we look at the entire text. It's a whole book. It's not just a little section. So with summary, we put the original text into our own words. We simplify it and focus on the main points of whatever it is that you're looking at. So paraphrases look at one part, summaries look at the whole. One thing that all of these have in common is that they have to name the author. So a lot of times people think that if they paraphrase or summarize something, they don't necessarily think that they need to name the author, but you always have to put the author's name into any kind of use of a source material. One of the strategies that we use for incorporating sources is from the book They Say, I Say, and it's a strategy called quote sandwiches, and I love them. Um, we start with an introduction, then we have our quote, and then we explain and comment on the quote. And like I said, I love my quote sandwiches. So the top piece of bread, the piece that begins our quote sandwich is basically a tag in which you're introducing the quote. So here we have this tag and that introduces the quote that's coming. So for an example here, the top piece of bread may look something like this. According to Elise Barker, instructor of English at Idaho State University, and then the next piece will come on. So, this top piece of bread, if you know anything about dialogue, it's basically exactly like that. So, you notice you have a name, said, comma, and then the whatever the person said. Same thing with quotation. Linda Berry explains, comma, and then our quote. So, some examples of what this looks like. Um, they have certain qualities that we look for. In academic writing, generally, we want to use present tense. Um, Even though Linda Berry wrote the book in the past, when we're talking about a text, we often talk about it in present tense because we're reading the text now. It's kind of a strange little thing that we do in academic writing, but it's definitely a norm. Another thing that you can do in your tag as you're presenting a quote is to introduce the source title in addition to the author's name. So we introduce here Linda Berry in her book, What It Is. You can also use the tag to indicate why the author is worth listening to, what their credentials are. So, in one context, we may want to highlight Linda Berry's uh, role as a cartoonist. Maybe in another context, we want to emphasize that she's an art educator. Kind of depends. But either way, we're trying to use her credentials to explain to your reader why she's somebody worth listening to. You can also use tags to transition from one source into the next. So here I have it just set up as a basic agree disagree. So Barry agrees with Lamont when she says blah blah blah. So it's sometimes you combine your strategies of the tag with a transition between two sources. So here's the middle part of our quote sandwich is the quote itself. So when you're talking about formatting quotes, again, if you have experience with dialogue, it's similar. So with the tag, we begin with a capital letter here, and you always, right before your quote, you always have a comma. Then you have your quotation marks, your first letter after at the beginning of your quotation mark um, after that first quotation mark is always capitalized. You may have to, it may not be that way in the actual text you're looking at, but go ahead and capitalize it. There's an exception here where you don't put the period inside of the quotation marks, but we'll get to that. In American writing, you always put the comma inside the quotation marks unless we have a parenthetical citation, and we'll get to that. So if you look at this, all of the example tags that I showed you before, they use the exact same formatting to begin and end their quote. They have a comma, quotation mark to begin it, um, capital letter here, period here, and in quotation. That's the same. Sometimes students will ask, well, what about end tags? And sometimes I see them in student writing, and I think that they, in some cases, can be really helpful. Newspaper writing, fiction writing, narrative, nonfiction, all those kinds of things. It's useful to be able to do the end tags occasionally just for variety. But in academic writing, we don't use them as often. When we talk about end tags, we that's when you begin with the quote and end with the tag. So we have something that Barry says, and then she says, Barry, you say Barry explains afterwards. Um, for academic writing, we shy away from that. So if we look at the quote sandwich, at this point, we have our tag and the quote that we've quoted. So here's a detail that sometimes I feel like I need to point out here. Uh, we have this number 13. It's a parenthetical citation. I'm going to talk about those more later, but it is something that goes along with quotations, and I will get to that. The next piece down is the explanation. This is our bottom piece of bread. So in this case, I have my comment, which I have about the quote that I've given. I write, "It is important to have delectable content because research papers should be enjoyable for the right reader." So, if you look at this rather than as a graphic, but as a paragraph, it would look something like this, where the red is our um, top piece of bread, the gray is the filling of our sandwich, and the blue is our explanation and commentary on the quote, and it's our bottom piece of bread. So, bottom pieces of bread are really important. we Sometimes people say, well, the quote speaks for itself. No, we don't want to do that. You want to help your readers understand the logic of your quotation choices. You put it there for a reason, and it's not always as obvious to your reader as it is to you. So you need to explain or comment on those quotes to help your reader through it. I wrote here too that it's an opportunity to answer your readers, so what? when they may have in response to your sources. So the bottom piece of bread, there's lots of things you can do with it. You can explain it, comment on it, expand it, take it to the next level, refute it, which means say why it's wrong, or you can use the quote or to use the bottom piece of bread to connect the quote to other ideas in your paper to transition into the next thing. Um, I think these scripts are helpful. So when we talk about scripts, these are things that are common ways of getting into this kind of explanation and commentary. So, in other words, let me explain, or similarly, to explain, this matters because I agree with this point because to take this idea further, this is really important to me because this relates to my experience because this is different from my experience because any of those kinds of setups for for your explanation and commentary is going to um, elevate the level of your writing and you'll help your reader. So basically, something that we don't want to ignore it. Um, Bottom bread connects the sources to the main ideas, and you really can't expect your readers to make that leap without your help. So let's get back to those parenthetical citations that I mentioned before, that number 13 from the original from way back then. When we talk about parenthetical citations, that word parenthetical refers to those parentheses surrounding the citation information. So parenthetical citations come after a quote or paraphrase to show on what page you found the quoted information. A parenthetical citation may also contain the author's last name, but it doesn't always. So in MLA, a parenthetical citation would look like this, where you have the author's last name and then the page number, followed by a period. One thing to note here is that this is that exception I mentioned before, where instead of having the period inside your quotation, it gets moved to after the parenthetical citation. That's our exception to having the period inside quotation marks. So if you've already named your author, you just need the page number. So if you've written according to Elise Barker in the text of your paper, all you need to do is include that page number. Here you can see where we may have just put a period after education, but because we have a page number, we move it to outside of the quotation or after the parenthetical citation. Different citation styles look different. All of them name the author. Some of them include the date, some include the page number, but all of them have the author's name. So something you can do is start mixing and matching with paraphrase and quote, in-text and parenthetical citations. This gives you some variety in your writing, and it also helps to keep it interesting while we're working. So here, when we use according to Elise Barker, blah blah blah, that's an in-text citation, and we end it with the parenthetical citation, just giving the number because I introduced the author here. In a parenthetical citation, here we didn't introduce the author, so we gave her credit here at the end in the parentheses. So the first time you introduce a source, give that author's full name, credentials, and the title. After you've done it once, you can revert to parenthetical citations after that first big introduction. Um, but in any case, you always name the author regardless of if it's in text or parenthetical, if it's a quote, or if it's here, we have a paraphrase, you got to name that author. So why do we do that? Why am I over and over saying name the author? It's because look at this. Can you tell in this sentence who's the source of the information? It's pretty clear. It's this person, Elise Barker. Who the heck is she? We know. Um, Here there is no name. So what does that lead us to conclude? For me, I think it must be the writer's voice here. Same here. We have the author's name, so we know that this idea that we've referenced here in in this sentence is from a source. If you don't have any kind of citation, whether in text or parenthetical, I'm going to assume that it's your own idea. And that's every sentence. You need to make some sort of reference to the sources that you're using, unless it's your own voice. So name the author in every sentence unless it's you speaking. If it's your own idea, if it's your voice, if it's your words, don't worry about it. But if it's someone else's, worry about it. And again, this is just you when I'm not going to put a big stop sign on the screen for this, but name those page numbers too if you can. So that's an option. Like I said about this with the parenthetical citation, in most uh, non-academic writing context, you don't need a parenthetical citation, page number, footnotes, endnotes, anything like that, especially if you have included a tag that just introduces the source naturally, like according to Barker, or something like that. But in academic writing, we do take that next step. So, why does this matter? Well, citing your sources is important so you don't commit plagiarism and that you have academic integrity. But all of these details are helpful because what we want to do is have a relationship between what you've written in the text with what appears on your works cited page. They play off of each other, and you can think of them almost like hyperlinks. So, what do I mean by that? Um, Whatever you use to identify your source in the text, it should have the information to send you in the right area of the alphabet where it appears in the works cited. So, for here, we have this source. We've introduced Linda Berry. We know that most of the time, works cited pages are alphabetized by last name of the author. So when we go looking for this source on the works cited page, we look for that B. That B gives us the information we need to go back to the works cited page, and there she is, and that's the full source. It's like a little hyperlink thing. It's kind of fun. It's like before hyperlinks were a thing, we had, you know, relationship between beginning and end of the document based on alphabetization. So let's play with this. It's not there's different ways of making this more organic and fun, and I hope that you get some good ideas here. Part of what you want to do in order to get this sort of organic feeling of using your sources is to think about all of these different voices as characters, and they're all having a conversation with each other, and you want to get them talking almost like characters if possible. So we want to get these writers talking to each other almost like dialogue. But before we start there, I think that it's smart to start with your story. So let me throw myself in there. If I put myself in there, um, I have this problem. I have writer's block and all of these kinds of people, and they can give me insight about how to help me through that. So, to start with my own story, this year, after receiving a handful of publication rejections, I have suddenly struggled to write. Because the editors of these publications were sometimes harsh, I keep hearing all their negative comments as I work. When I'm writing, a voice is always whispering in my ear. It's pointing out all my punctuation mistakes and making fun of the things I want to say. Okay, there we go. So that's me. That's my voice here. What I've done here is now I'm bringing in those other voices. And also, well, let me read it. Then I read Linda Berry's graphic novel, What It Is, and found out I'm not alone. Berry explains the two questions: is it good and does it suck? Find everybody. She argues without the two questions, so much is possible. Similarly, Anne Lamott also argues that it isn't useful to dwell on perfection, especially early in the drafting process. In Bird by Bird, Lamott explains almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. So if we kind of look at this and figure and see what each piece of this what this is doing, you see a transitional word here that connects my story to what I'm getting ready to talk about. I introduce this, have an introductory tag with Linda Berry's name and the name of her book, a little bit of explanation where I connect that book to my experience in the previous paragraph. Then we have a tag, a quote, a tag, another quote, a transition to the next source, a tag for this new source, a paraphrase here. We have another tag and a quote. So a question that I see is that, wow, this is really lacking explanation. I probably need to come in here and add some explanation, maybe definitely probably here. Sometimes that setup that I did, that previous paragraph kind of gives us the explanation we need. Um, but I think to improve it, a simple sentence may help us to pad out and get that bottom piece of bread to help us make sense of it. So I've added a little bit here. I said almost, or Lamont says, almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. My explanation, after all that rejection, I needed to help myself get started again. So I connected that quote to my own experience. Next paragraph here. How do I chase away the two questions and embrace my shitty first drafts? That's what Lamont calls them. I like to follow the advice of poet William Stafford, who says there's no such thing as writer's block for writers whose standards are low enough. When I remember Stafford's word, I think of my writer friends who aren't hugely talented yet still manage to write and sell books. If they can do it, so can I. So if you look at this, we have a transition from the previous idea of my own experience and the two questions and moving forward. And then I have an introduction of another expert on writer's block, William Stafford, a quote from him, and then explanation, and where I've again recontextualized that information in terms of my own experiences. Another paragraph. Another thing that helps me chase away the paralyzing two questions is William Zinzer's advice in his book On Writing Well, in which he argues if you consciously write for a teacher or editor, you'll end up not writing for anybody. If you write for yourself, you'll reach the people you want to write for. Never fails me. I stop worrying about whether someone else will like my writing, and suddenly the words start flowing. I can revise with an audience in mind later, but I need to fill some pages first. Isn't it glorious that quote sandwich, that top piece of bread, the quote, which is the delicious center of our sandwich, and the bottom piece of bread, which holds it all together. I just love it. I hope you can also see part of what I've done here is I put myself in conversation with other writers. It's cool. It's a skill that will serve you well if you continue writing in academic contexts. So that quote sandwich, use them, love them. Get to know that quote sandwich and have it be a strategy you can pull out whenever you need to. Just to point out, I have my works cited here. Again, should have been able to find all of these people based on the information that I gave in the text. We had their last names, and because we had those last names, we can come to the works cited, look for the alphabetical order, and find the people in the conversation with me on my works cited. Are you still confused about your citations? Don't forget that we have my MLA citation format video that you can watch and that citation handout. You are free to contact me whenever you want to. And of course, citation generators are always an option, especially if you are struggling right at the last minute. So that's the end. I hope that you have some happy quote sandwiching, and I think that's it. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope that you have fun with all those quote sandwiches.